Well, Hester and Judith, thank you very much for joining us on the programme. Hester, this is a story of a family that goes through the worst sort of trauma. Just tell us how the story started.
Well, this, as you say, it was a terrible tragedy, but this was a family of 4 fulfilling their lifelong dream, and it did turn into everyone's worst nightmare. They were planning a 5-year circumnavigation of the world. They were out almost 3 years and 30 miles off the coast of New Zealand. A ship with no lights, no radar, no warning sounds, no radio communication, kept watching the lights of the sailboat of the Sleavin family, the Melinda Lee, and they didn't alter course to avoid a collision or make anybody aware that they were even out there. It was a dark and stormy night, and they just kept approaching the sailboat until there was no recourse but to alter the course that they were on. And at random, they chose 10 degrees, hence part of the name, and turned right into the Sleavin sailboat and killed their son Ben, who was right at the point of impact. The impact was so huge that it had sheared everything off the deck, and the life raft that was in a stainless steel carrier too went with it. So to their horror, they were already so grief-stricken because this was such a loving family, and they had to leave their son Ben behind. Fortunately, a half-inflated dinghy that was still tied to a part of the boat, which was by now rapidly sinking, was at least manageable to get off. But as I say, it was half inflated for the passage, and there would be no means to propel them in the right direction because the oars and the motor had been safely stowed. So they had to depend upon this. They also thought that this ship would somehow rescue them because the laws of the sea say that. It's a United Nations clause that says that if you're not put at risk, and of course there was no risk to the ship, that at least they would, you know, be able to get safely ashore. It was a hit and run. The ship left them there.
It's, as you say, it's the worst trauma that you can think of. There's a heartbreaking moment in it where Michael, Judith's husband, says, I think we should go and join Ben, who had died, and pulls you both into the water. It's just, it must have been his, you know, it pushes someone to the absolute limit.
Judith was on watch, and so she was the one most alert to what was happening. And Mike was quite determined to go down there, and Judith knew she would lose him if he did. So she had to exert some pressure to have him come with her and Annie. And then further to that, he couldn't really make decisions. He was much more hypothermic than Judith or Annie because he was in sleeping clothes and he wouldn't take anything. And by this point, because Judith was the person on watch, she was the most stressed but also the most injured. So with vertebrae crushed and fractured, she would not have been able to get off any clothing without his help. And he said, no, I want my, you know, I want you and Annie to have whatever clothing.
Because the weather was not good.
Yes, and I mean, the waters are cold coming into New Zealand in November, and they had already been dumped into the sea a few times in this half-inflated dinghy. So
it was windy, so the wind chill factor brings your temperature down. You start losing your, you know, you don't want to lose your core temperature, but when you don't have adequate clothing on and you're in the water, it's really difficult.
So then time goes by, you're in the water. What happened after that?
Mike and Annie made it through the whole night in these terrible seas, in this half-inflated dinghy. Their deaths, when they came in the morning because of higher seas, was completely unnecessary, completely unnecessary. No calls went to any officials. And so the waves built up, the wind built up, and they had a terrible time staying on this dinghy. A large wave came, they were all spilled out in different directions. And for a few moments, Michael had the old presence of mind. They had so many routines, and when they were in an anchorage and there was any kind of wind change or a shark came or something, it was, Judith, you get the dinghy, I'll get the children. And so the same thing happened. Right. He said, Judith, you get the dinghy, I'll get Annie. Well, by then, it was, Judith went to get it because they would need something to have. And she realized as he was getting further away that he, a strong swimmer, was completely uncoordinated because of his hypothermia, and it was like watching someone in quicksand. And he couldn't get to Annie before she died, and then he himself died.
It must have been so hard to read what Hester wrote, to read that passage again.
Yeah. It wasn't as hard as being there, but yeah, it's difficult.
You ended up, of all places, in the Bay of Islands, here in New Zealand. But even that wasn't simple. It wasn't just a case of turning up in Paihia and being rescued.
You know, that's an interesting thing for me, because I've sailed to New Zealand twice, and I knew the area of the collision. The police sergeant who eventually spotted her told me that with the prevailing winds the way they usually would be, that when they went out, that they were sure that, well, they were looking for a sailboat also, but that the sailboat and all bodies would have to be smashed up against the rocks of Cape Brett, that nobody would ever make it into a sheltered cove. And when he first didn't spot her. He first spotted what he thought were two other people kind of sitting with what he thought was a little boat, that they were having a picnic. And he insisted that the pilot turn around and go back to look. And he said to me later, those were her guardian angels, Hester. Those were her guardian angels. And there are a lot of people who think that she, by some divine intervention, that she made it around into that area so that she could tell the story. And there's a lot of things that can't be explained, really.
I felt I was going to be found. I felt I had to be found. I felt this strong sense of hope. You know, I was hoping it didn't include a rocky shore with big waves. That was very scary for me when I finally was getting towards shore, and then hearing these big waves crashing on these rocks that were covered with oyster shells. And I felt I didn't want to die like this. I mean, I have the story to tell, and so it was...
Incredibly you have.
Yeah.
Well, it's a remarkable partnership, a remarkable book. Thank you both.
Thank you very much for having us. We really enjoyed being here. Thank you, Allan.
Thank you, Allan.